Steele-John. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. And I too rise to speak on the Disability Services and Inclusion Bill 2023, Disability Services and Inclusion Bill. Can I first of all start by endorsing many of the things that my Greens colleague, Senator Steele-John, has said here today. And while we don't always agree on many issues, I think many of the things that Senator Steele-John and Senator Ruston and others have said on this ring very powerfully true, and they resonate with me, and I know many others, because while we look at things through different philosophical frameworks, the Australian Disability Strategy, the NDIS indeed, really support very strong. They're fundamental. In fact, you could argue that they are very liberal policies and programs. And I say that because the NDIS and the Australian Disability Strategy that Senator Ruston as Minister and myself as NDIS Minister were proud to implement go to the heart of many of the things that Senator Steele-John has been talking about today, and that is inclusion. Whereas as Liberals, we look at it through the rights of all individuals to realise their own life aspirations, to have power, control and responsibility over their own lives. And I came to learn as the NDIS Minister about the history of how this nation has treated people with disability. And in previous years, and still there are echoes of this today, far too loud echoes of where at a time we looked at people with disability as people not to include in mainstream society, but to define them by their disability and not to define them and support them in line with their many abilities. And people particularly with serious and permanent disability were locked away. Parents were told the only option for them was not education, it was not supports to help them realise their own aspirations and to have self-control over their lives and the course of their lives, and to have the dignity of risk. So, we did have a shameful history, I think, looking back, of institutionalisation of people with disabilities, where many were isolated and their lives were defined by their disabilities, but they were not supported either, as they should have been. Too many were subject to coercive controls, physical and chemical, and shamefully that still continues today. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people with disabilities who have been forcibly sterilised, who have been involuntarily subject to birth control, who still do not get the supports they need to realise their own life aspirations and for inclusion in our society. So much has changed since the current Act was legislated. So on this side, we are supporting this bill, but like so many, in fact pretty much every other piece of legislation those opposite have brought forward, it is deficient, and I'll go through some of those deficiencies later. But it does go some way to improving the situation, but again, not as much as we would like. And on a personal note, can I also say I agree with Senator Steele-John in terms of the need for a dedicated cabinet-level minister for disability, not only for the NDIS, but also to take responsibility for all disability-related services and supports, so that finally we can have a single minister responsible for coherent disability policy. And it's a little bit of a shame that the Labor Party hasn't taken that opportunity to make those arrangements, but it is never too late. So over the last decade, since the introduction of the NDIS, we have adopted the Convention of the Rights of Persons with Disability, and we are now on our second decade-long National Disability Strategy, which I said in the Coalition we were very pleased to deliver that. But can I also remind all colleagues in this chamber that not only did we release the Australian Disability Strategy, which was a transformative new strategy backed by a $250 million investment to provide a robust framework to deliver real and positive life changes for people with a disability. We also appointed the wonderful Dr Ben Gauntlet as Disability Discrimination Commissioner, and he was also appointed by Minister Ruston at the time to chair the Strategies Advisory Council to support the implementation. And the strategy itself does set out priorities and plans for governments at all levels, and I think that it is a positive step forward. But I think one of the most important things that the strategy, which unfortunately we've seen very little evidence that this government has embraced and is implementing, but from my perspective the most important aspect of that was that it was signed off by all states and territories. Because to really move forward in disability strategy over the next decade in this nation, states and territories have to step up. They've done what many states and territories do best. When the NDIS came into being a decade ago, they defunded their own disability strategies, which was completely opposite to what they were supposed to do in their agreements with the NDIS, and continued to provide community supports for the 4 million people who were not eligible for the NDIS, because they didn't have, at the time, what we saw as the most serious and permanent disabilities. So we've also seen no action at all. We've heard a lot of rhetoric from Minister Shorten, but actually no action at all yet on renegotiating the intergovernmental agreements on the National Disability Insurance Scheme, because until that is done and states and territories accept their responsibility under the Australian Disability Strategy, to accept their responsibilities in the recommendations in the Royal Commission, which again this government has demonstrated no urgency and no progress in implementing the Royal Commission's recommendations. So the states and territories, so this government, halfway through their term, haven't even released the independent review of the NDIS yet, and by all accounts they have no intention of releasing that, and no intention of releasing this year's actuarial report, the AFSR, which would actually give us some idea of how they intend to make $74 billion worth of savings out of the NDIS over the next decade, without apparently cutting a plan or participant numbers, which is completely impossible. The sector knows that, we know that on this side, but yet those opposite are still maintaining that myth, which is a cruel fraud and a cruel hoax on everybody with a disability and their families. So coming back to the bill itself, the bill does establish an updated framework for the funding and regulation of programs that support 1 in 6 Australians with a disability, their families and their carers. And it does also make some consequential amendments to other bills and arrangements. So while we do support this bill and the updating of this framework, as usual, it is deficient in a number of areas, but which we would hope that the government will now start looking at amendments. Why they did not address these areas in the drafting of the bill is completely beyond me, because that seemed like such a logical thing to do. If you're going to bring forward this bill, they should have actually made sure they brought forward the best possible bill. But then we look at the complete debacle of yesterday. 30 years in this working in this building, I have never seen such incompetence. The government knew since June that was a quite possibility, and they waited until yesterday to present a highly deficient bill, but fortunately they did accept the Coalition's amendments to strengthen the bill. But again, time after time, they keep bringing forward these deficient bills. So what are the issues that we have with this bill that need to be addressed? The first one is it does not define target groups that will be eligible for support and services. Now, on the one hand, you understand by broadening it, because there are a lot of complexities with individuals with a range of complex disabilities. But knowing the incompetence of those opposites, a bit like with the NDIS, they refused to have some form of standardised assessments, which have made it all too easy now for states to move people into the scheme without any controls, and arguably people who should be looked after under state schemes and not the NDIS. So this is a departure from the current legislation, and it is not yet very clear what are the implications of that. Also, under Section 8 in the current legislation, the Disability Services Act, target groups consist of people with a disability such as it's attributable to an intellectual, psychiatric, sensory or physical impairment or a combination of such impairments, is permanent or is likely to be permanent, and it results in a substantially reduced capacity of the person for communication, learning or mobility, and the need for ongoing support services. So while not having a legislated definition of a target group may provide, as I've said, greater flexibility and access to services and supports for those who are a little more challenging to diagnose, there will certainly be unknown practical consequential impacts on the provision and delivery of timely supports and services for those who most need it. And I think that bringing forward this bill, that those opposite have learnt not a thing about the flaws that they baked into the NDIS legislation 10 years ago, is a portent of what will now happen with this legislation, because it was very clear, very quickly, that what they couldn't have baked into the legislation 10 years ago when they were last in government, greater flaws for an insurance scheme. So where did they go wrong with that scheme? First of all, there are two drivers of scheme cost for the Australian taxpayers. The first one is participant numbers and participant plans, the cost of individual participant plans and the average cost. So what did the geniuses in government then, who are now back in government benches? So they made sure that the government minister of the day couldn't control either lever of cost. They gave it to an independent board who was not responsible for managing the budget that the federal government and the federal taxpayers had given them. And so those geniuses, when they developed that legislation, not only did they not give the government control of those two levers, guess what they did? They baked into the federal legislation that neither of those levers could be changed without the unanimous support of the state and territory governments. And what state or territory government is going to give the federal government control when they have just shunted financial responsibility to the federal government, which the federal government can't control? So as minister, I went to Bill Shorten as the shadow minister at the time and said, let's work together on a bipartisan basis so we can put this scheme on a sustainable financial future so that those who most need it, those with serious and permanent disability, can be assured that they will have this scheme to make sure that they can live a life in accordance with their own aspirations. They do have self-determination over their lives, and they have a dignity to live their lives and to make risks and to have risks in their lives as the rest of us do. But no, Mr Shorten instead has played politics with this. He is still playing politics with this. He's now created this mythical promise which everybody in the sector knows cannot be delivered. You cannot make $74 billion worth of savings and not cut participant plans and not cut participant packages. In fact, it's on track now to be over $74 billion, and what the government has done is they've banked the savings over the next 10 years based on baseline data from last financial year. But guess what? Not only is it going to be more than the $74 billion that they've saved, well, they say they've saved, but they're on track. Instead of for the 8% they want to moderate costs to over the next decade, it's gone from 12% to 15% in 1 quarter alone. So while we will accept this legislation as better than nothing, like every other piece of legislation and everything those opposite touch in the disability sector, it is making people's lives worse, and that is the tragedy. Because we are working across the aisles together with the Greens, because even though we have come from different philosophical bases, we want people, all Australians with disability, to have the same life opportunities as the Greens say, inclusion, but we call it to realise their own aspiration. And those opposite are making sure that's going to be harder and harder.
Time has expired.